My guest today is Kim Griffin, an occupational therapist who has been working with children with SEN for nearly 20 years now. Her current focus is providing online training and schemes of work for educators, and her flagship course is on sensory processing, which is what we're going to talk about today. Kim is really keen to ensure that the training explains the why behind the what as well. So she's here today to chat all things sensory processing and how the way children process their environment can affect their behaviour. Let's get to the interview. Kim, welcome to the Teachers Podcast.
Hi Claire, it's great to be here.
So you're in sunny Australia right now. So we found a really good time to chat. Thankfully, it's not in the middle of the night for you. I was a bit worried about that, so good. Anyway, right, so let's talk about sensory processing. So can you explain what sensory processing is in simple terms for me, mainly, but for anyone who has not heard of it before?
Sure. So when I use the term sensory processing, I'm thinking about how the brain is processing or interpreting the sensory messages it receives from the environment and the body. So it's different to a sensory impairment. So it's different to if someone's deaf or if someone's blind. In those cases, there's actually a problem, say, with their eyes or with their ears, and the messages aren't actually coming in the first place in the same way. When OTs, I'm an occupational therapist, so when OTs use the term sensory processing, they're referring to, okay, so the ears have heard that information, or the eyes have seen, or the skin has felt. What does the brain then do with that information, and how does it react to that information? How does it use that information to plan activities, and how does it use that information to stay engaged in learning? So I will just put the caveat in there because I know it's incredibly confusing. Sensory processing disorder, although the term is used very frequently, it's still not a medically diagnosable disorder as such. So even though you'll read and hear the term, and it'll be in medical documents, it doesn't exist as a disorder in its own right. It has been very much included in the autism diagnosis in the last updates to that, but it hasn't been included as its own disorder as such, even though a lot of researchers are trying to work towards getting it identified as a standalone. So I'll just put that caveat in there at the beginning because I know it's very confusing.
Yeah, that is really interesting to know. You explained that so well. So it's not that we don't have the sensors. It's not that we're not receiving them, like you said, the information. It's just how we use that information, I guess, more than anything.
Yeah, and then do you want me to explain sort of the breakdown? I mean, there's a couple of different models of sensory processing, sensory integration.
Yeah, that would be great because none of that makes sense to me. Go.
So the original term that was used by Jean Ayres, who's essentially seen as the grandmother of sensory integration, sensory processing, she used the term sensory integration. And her model used a very specific assessment called the sensory integration and praxis test. It's a very in-depth test, and she broke her diagnosis down into things like dyspraxia, which often included a lot of difficulties with processing the touch sense, is something she loaded there, and also organizing your movement and planning what your movement's going to be. She also, although her model didn't strictly include what is now called reactivity, she did notice that some children had bigger responses to particularly touch than others. So like in one of the assessments, there's this little puppet and it touched your nose, and some of the children would like freak out when the puppet came near them or touched them, and she noticed, or when their skin was being touched, she noticed that their reaction was almost a fright reaction to what you would think of as sort of normal touch, or not, it shouldn't be scary touch. As as the sort of diagnoses are such as, or diagnosis is the wrong word, as the model has evolved, the current model of sensory processing includes what they call modulation. So that's your response to information. So if the clock's ticking, can you ignore it? Or if you do get that touch, do you get a fright or do you not even notice? So there's that differentiation between over response, or what you'll read as hyper reactive, or a slower under response, or a hypo reaction. So there's those two types of reaction, and obviously there's the in the middle. But as an OT, I don't see the in the middle kids. I see the top. I see the top and the bottom. It's very rare for me to see an in the middle child. And then the movement side of things pull in with things like dyspraxia and also what's called discrimination. So the ability to actually identify the qualities of sensation. So if you hear a noise, where was it? Was it behind you, in front of you, on your left or on your right? Was it loud? Was it soft? Because if you struggle with that, it makes sort of engaging in the environment much more difficult.
Does it improve then? Just thinking about the touch thing you were talking about there.
Yeah.
You said that you work with children who are high and low.
Yeah.
Can it be improved, or do you kind of just learn to live with it as an adult?
So there's a couple of pieces there. There's definitely the literature will definitely show some changes. So particularly so movement seeking seems to be more common in younger children, and that seems to decrease in the literature as an overall. That seems to decrease as children get older. With things like touch sensitivity, the literature would suggest that the neurological threshold as such is there, but when you become an adult, so say school uniforms are tricky for you. Say you find the fabric of your school uniform itchy, scratchy, and horrible. When you're an adult, you don't have to wear a school uniform. You can adjust your environment in a much greater way than you can as a child, and you can adjust it very differently to if you're having to go to school. Because when you go to school, there's so much that you sort of just really have to conform with, because school is set up in a particular structure and in a particular way. So yeah, as the children become adults, it's not necessarily there is definitely a shift for some of the reactions, and some people find strategies that support them. So say, for example, touch sensitivity, often a lot of proprioceptive input. So that's the movement, the input you get from your muscles and joints when you move. So that can be quite calming. So kids maybe with touch sensitivity, they might swim, they might cycle, they might be their activities that help to keep their system calmer, and that decreases their touch sensitivity. But it's those activities that are sort of helping to dampen that response that is there. And a lot of autistic adults will report that their sensory sensitivities are still very real and still very there. And yes, they may have shifted and changed through, as they've grown up, they've learned strategies to compensate, which are hugely helpful. They might not go to events or certain things that they know will trigger them, which keeps them calmer. So rather than doing the three things that make them totally overloaded, they choose one of them and they're a bit overloaded rather than fully overloaded. So yeah, children often have a lot less choice in how they structure their day and their life, really. So there is definitely a change, but the literature would suggest that it is a lifelong sort of neurological, what's the word? Just threshold sort of baseline that is there as a lifelong piece.
Yeah, you just learn to live with it. That's really interesting. Thank you. Okay then. So I feel like I've had a really in-depth science lesson. So why is it important then that teachers understand sensory processing? How can it help them in the classroom?
So I think for me the biggest the biggest aha really is the impact that it has on behavior. And I think often when educators, so teachers, teaching assistants, support staff, if they're not aware of sensory, because typically what you observe if a child's got a sensory need is a behavior. So they're either avoiding or they're kicking off because their peer touched them. You know, they got bumped into and they hit their peer, because for them that bumping into actually felt like they'd been hit. So they turn around and they hit their peer, and then they get sent to the principal's, the head teacher's office, and they're in trouble. Or they're maybe not joining in PE and they're always feeling sick and having to go to the school nurse. Or the sensory, say they might do really well in the library because it's nice and quiet, but then you get to PE lesson, which is a lot noisy, a lot more echo if it's in the hall, and the child's not managing it. Sometimes, not always, there are definitely other things at play for children, but for some children it is an underlying sensory need that actually is causing that behavior. And if you're treating it with like a behavioral approach, like, you know, I had one little boy who was touch sensitive, and he used to hit his peers in the coat room because it was a small, most schools in the UK, I find they've got these little cloak rooms where you put your coat up and your bag up and then you go into class. And his was, it was particularly small and particularly crowded. And I think they were year 3, so the kids are getting that bit bigger as well. And he used to hit kids, and he'd get sent to the principal's office. And there's this beautiful sofa that he could sit at outside the principal's office. Like, for him, that's a reward because it's quiet, there's no one touching him. And his behavior didn't change. But when I shifted it to, okay, you can go into the cloakroom first, and if you hit a child, you have to write lines. And I'm not one for old school punishment, but I knew he hated handwriting, so I chose something that was a real thing that he hated, and we put in an adaptation for him as well, that he could go in first, so therefore he wouldn't be touched and it wouldn't be overloading. He didn't hit another child. So, but without that kind of awareness of sensory, if you just continue to treat it as naughty behavior and disobedient behavior, he could have been excluded in another couple of weeks because he was hitting. For me, it's just that if you've got that understanding of sensory processing of all your different senses, you understand why that kid can't get their glue stick off, or why when they go to reach for the pencils, they're pushing over their peers, because their proprioceptive awareness is so poor, they don't know where their body is. They're not deliberately stepping on their peer, or they're not deliberately like hitting their peer with their arm. They just have no idea where their body is. So if you make that adjustment of, okay, well, we'll give you a bit more space beside you, then that actually resolves the issue. But telling them to like be careful is not necessarily going to help them, because they're not being obstinate. They genuinely don't know where their body is. As a complete side note, I'm at home at the moment, and I was reading my ballet. I'm going through all my old stuff, and I was reading my ballet reports from when I was like 5 years to 11 years old. Every year they said my arms weren't aligned. Every year they commented on how bad my arm position is. I am quite hypermobile, and I don't have great proprioceptive awareness. The reason my arms in ballet were horrible is because I couldn't get them aligned very well. And my teachers for 6 years tried to fix that using whatever strategies they were using in the 80s and 90s, and the outcome is my arms are still terrible.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying that, and you've brought that in, because the whole time you've been talking, what I've been thinking about is that I don't like being touched. Like if somebody comes up and pokes you in the arm, that feels like really painful to me.
Yeah.
And I've like looked it up, like, what is this thing? I do not like being touched. And it's quite funny because we've opened the office again at Classroom Secrets, and as part of the whole COVID thing, people have got lanyards, and just like, how comfortable are you with like being touched or not? Like, you can have a red one if you don't want to be hugged, yellow if you're okay, or green if you're in for everything. And I was like, I want a red one, but not for COVID, just anyway. Don't come and hug me, I don't like it.
Yeah,
so it's really interesting to listen, because I'm thinking, This is in my life still now.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I like the lanyards are great, and I've seen them particularly at autistic conferences. Like they're very common in terms of like, yeah, I'm happy to chat or no, and some of them do ones that turn around, so you can kind of you can regulate it through the day. Like,
You
yeah,
can
I'm
change
okay
your mind,
now,
yeah.
but like later on, you can slip it out to like leave me alone. Like I've
Yeah.
had my fill, go away. And I think they're a great idea in terms of just for regular people, because I mean there are times where you're just like, actually, I could do with a 10 minute, like, just stay away from me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, right then. So, why are you so passionate then about educating people on sensory needs of children?
I think the thing that drives me is very much the change that I see, and that just that aha when I can share that knowledge, and people, it just makes so much sense. Like when sensory is the issue and when sensory is the driver, it just makes so much sense. And you can put the supports in place or the changes in place or the environmental adaptations in place, and you just can make such a difference in that child's ability to engage and participate. And that's what I love to be able to do, because I know that difficulty with sensory processing really does impact functionally. It impacts engagement. It impacts learning. And to be able to sort of see the change it makes when you're supporting those kids um, appropriately, it's just, yeah, it's fantastic. And I know the kids. I know the kids and parents and even the teachers. Like I know on my training, because I have online training on sensory processing, and I go through all the senses and the different types of responses and what they look like and how to support them. And the number of teachers that just sort of say, I wish this was included in my original training, or like, oh my lord, so much stuff of, the behaviors that I've seen for X, Y, and Z child have just made sense. Or even the neurology, I cover some of the neurology and the fight, flight, freeze response and things like that. And it's not taught in teacher training. And I mean, the literature would suggest that somewhere between 5 to 15% of people have sensory differences. I mean, that's 3 to 5 kids in every classroom. So it's not like you're going to come across one of these kids in your teaching career. You probably have 3 of these kids in your classroom right now. Like, so it's not this obscure kind of, thing. It's pretty common. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I love this, and I think I've learned obviously a lot more about the brain since I left teaching.
Mm.
But it does make you think, why did we not know this in teaching? I suppose part of the problem is as a teacher you can feel like you need to know everything, and what we want to do is be able to say, oh, I don't need to worry about that. But
Yeah.
I think just continually learning something new like this is so important and helps us so much. So you're a teacher and you've been listening to this and you're thinking, this is amazing. I've learned something new, just like Claire. It's been a science lesson. What are the 3 actionable steps that people could try out right now?
Yeah. So I think step number 1 would be, if you're not familiar with the 8 senses. So you'll know sight, touch, taste, smell, hearing. But if you're not familiar with the terms proprioception, vestibular, and interoception, I would highly recommend doing some reading on them. I'll do my self-promotion in there. I've got 3 articles on my website, and I've got a free 1-hour training on them that you can do. And there are loads and loads of websites out there that cover the information. I'm biased towards mine, obviously, but
That's what I'm here to talk about, isn't it?
Yeah, you will find the information, and there's. Can I include a couple of book references in the notes of the show? Yeah, I'll send Claire a couple, because there's a couple which I should know off the top of my head, but I never remember the author's names correctly. But I'll include them as well. So there's a couple of books that are really nice, just introductions to understanding sensory. Step number 2 is just to start, once you've done step 1, is to start just reframing your observation slightly of behavior to think, well, could this actually have a sensory need? Or even layering into that, could there be a language or just another learning need in there? Because I know we're talking about sensory, but it's not always sensory. It could be that language or that other learning need. Like what's actually the driver of this behavior? Because in my experience, it's for most of these kids, the behavior is just that the external thing you finally see, but there's usually things sort of underlying it. If you can unpick those, and if you need help from your Senko to do that, approach them. But putting those sensory goggles into your unpicking will hopefully help just with that, give you that broader ability to perspective. And number 3 would be to consider just as a whole class, where are your children in terms of I haven't touched on arousal, but I pull arousal, so that a level of alertness and energy, I pull that into sensory processing as well, because your senses sort of impact your arousal and your attention to engage in that. So just thinking about your classroom and thinking about what are the sensory inputs that the children are experiencing in your classroom, and are they allowing them to focus on that? Or, is it really busy visually? Do you have loads and loads of visual kind of things up that actually, for a child that might find their visual attention tricky, that might be really distracting? So just having a look at your classroom and thinking, well, is this potentially overloading for a child that does experience that sensory sensitivity? And how is my class managing their own arousal? Do we occasionally need to do that energizing? They call them brain breaks sometimes. Like, do we need to do that energizer or that movement break to bring their arousal up, or do we need to drop their arousal down to sort of get them ready and engaged for learning? Yeah, so that would be my 3. A bit of education on sensory, thinking about sensory when you're doing your behavior analysis, and just thinking about the setup of your classroom and the sensations that the kids are experiencing in there and how they're impacting their ability to sort of focus and be ready for learning.
They're amazing tips, Kim. Thank you. So you talked about that you've got a free training and articles on your website. Where can we find you?
So it's just griffinot.com. So my surname is Griffin, so it's spelled the same, like the mythical creature, half lion, half eagle, I think. I always get it the wrong way around. It could be half eagle, I don't know. So yeah, griffinot.com. And again, if you just search GriffinOT, or even usually Kim Griffin in Google, I think I've done well enough on my SEO that I pop up reasonably close to the top. And there's a sensory menu on the website there, and I'm on all the usual. I'm on all the usual social channels. I think I've already shared them with Claire, but I can send them across and put them in the show notes as well. So yeah, it's usually some form of Griffin OT. I think Facebook's Griffin Sensory OT. But yeah, so I'm around.
Super. Well, thank you so much. I've definitely learned something today. I'm going to be thinking next time somebody tries to poke me or hug me, please don't do that.
And that's okay to put those boundaries in place. Like, completely okay.
Yeah, which I do. Like, do not hug me. I'm not doing a hug. But thank you so much. It's been a lovely chat. I'm going to let you go to bed now.
Yes. Have a good day. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.